Welcome to Great Minds. I'm Beth Simmons, Professor of Law and Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania. Human rights represented a profound challenge to sovereign states. And in many ways, therefore, it's remarkable that they've flourished at all. But it's not surprising that as they've taken hold and as they've spread, states would begin to lash back. The rights revolution has had some real gains, and I think it's important that we recognize these gains so that we can then put into context the backlash that we're seeing in some parts of the world. For example, the number of deaths from genocide have drastically declined since the 70s, 80s, and 90s. States that use the death penalty now, a violation of human rights, are really relatively few. Death from famine, starvation, and severe malnutrition has fallen since the 1960s. Gender inequality has fallen in terms of years in school and literacy rates, as well as earnings ratios. Even measures of physical integrity, which indicate torture or detention, seem to have improved over time. So what accounts for some of these improvements? In the background, what's really going on is that democratization, the rise and decline of democracy, has a lot to do with how human rights are practiced. Moreover, as I've indicated in earlier lectures, massive increases in the organization of civil society around human rights, especially in the 1970s, have really caused an increase in the advocacy in this space and have had and should be getting a lot of credit for rights improvements over time. New technologies for gathering information have also contributed to the realization of human rights and the avoidance of some of the worst kinds of violations. For example, the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights has made use of satellite imagery to detect where detention camps are kept. And they've also used these kinds of images to try to detect where there are mass graves around the world. Cell phones is a very common technology for attempting to hold certain actors accountable. For example, in the United States, police brutality has been a real problem. Discrimination along racial lines has been a serious difficulty in the United States. And cell phones have been very common for trying to hold police officers far more accountable for the actions they take when they make arrests or when they attempt to get a suspect under control. So as accountability increases, we learn a lot more. We learn more and more about human rights violations around the world. It makes it harder then to perceive that there really have been a lot of positive changes. The more information we have, the worse things seem to get. But that's because we're able to discover and uncover more human rights violations than has ever been the case before. One of the important reasons that we've seen continuing human rights violations, and in some cases worsening violations, is that democracies around the world are starting to backslide in a noticeable way. Democratic backsliding is a prelude to a lot of the backlash that we're seeing around the world on human rights practices.
Journalism is not a crime. Free Turkey media.
So, for example, a country like Turkey, long a democracy, has had a real sort of backslide with respect to the freedom of the media, and now has more people in prison, more journalists in prison, than even a country like China, who is, of course, much, much bigger. In Hungary, there's practically not an independent judiciary anymore. The Orban government has been able, essentially, to pack courts, the Constitutional Court, with his political allies, and so effectively the court doesn't put any check on the government at all. Electoral institutions, of course, have been undermined in Hong Kong, where the electoral laws have been essentially engineered such that people who are friends of the regime are those who will be elected, and people that China deems unpatriotic are kept from positions of political power. So this is reflected in sort of a backlash against international human rights and institutions as well.